Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the food that fueled one of history's most powerful empires, the Romans. Imagine yourself walking down a bustling Roman street in the midday heat. The air smells of freshly baked bread, strong wine, and an odd, pungent, fishy scent. The sound of street vendors calling out their wares blends with the chatter of market goers. You're probably wondering, what did ordinary Romans eat in a day? Well, let me set the scene for you. It wasn't just about bread and pain. Although those were central to the diet, the average Roman citizen's meals were a mix of practicality and odd indulgences, all wrapped up in a cultural experience. First, let's talk about the daily basics. Romans were very into their grains. Bread was a major part of their diet, with many households baking their own. But it wasn't the soft, pillowy loaves you might be familiar with today. Roman bread was often a bit hard, dense, and rough, perfect for dipping into soups or stews. Most Romans didn't have access to fancy cuts of meat, so their meals were heavily reliant on grains, legumes, and vegetables. You could almost say it was a carb-heavy, low-protein kind of existence, unless, of course, you were rich or powerful. Historians still argue whether the plebeians, common citizens of Rome, had access to enough nutrition for long-term health, or if their diet led to chronic deficiencies. While we know that the elite enjoyed much fancier meals, the average Roman ate a simple combination of bread, beans, and vegetables, topped off with a little bit of wine. That wine, not a relaxing glass of Chardonnay. It was diluted with water, sometimes flavored with herbs, and often consumed at every meal. Now, before you get too comfortable picturing Roman dining, take a quick moment to think about how strange it must have been to feast alongside your fellow Romans. From the smell of baked goods to the idea of eating a dinner without forks, their meals were definitely not what you'd expect in today's culture. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might want to leave that pizza delivery for another night, because, trust me, tonight's meal comes with a Roman twist. As we slide into this next part of our Roman dining adventure, imagine yourself at one of those extravagant Roman banquets. It's a little dim, with soft candlelight flickering across the long marble tables. The room hums with quiet conversation, but every so often, a servant bursts through with another dish. These banquets were not just about food. They were a spectacle. For the elite, dining was a way to show off wealth, power, and social standing. If you were rich, you had a much different experience than the average Roman in the streets. The Roman feast, or convivium, was the event of the day. For the wealthy, this could mean piles of food, lavish decorations, and entertainment to fill the long hours of eating. And when I say long, I mean long Roman banquets could stretch over several hours, with courses arriving one after another. The food wasn't just filling, it was often exotic. Think roasted peacock, flamingo tongues. Yes, flamingo tongues and boiled ostrich. Now it sounds like something straight out of a food challenge. But for the Romans, this was the norm. One of the more curious features of these feasts was the emphasis on excess. Romans didn't just eat, they overindulged. And it wasn't just about quantity. Many of the dishes were carefully prepared to overwhelm the senses with textures, smells, and flavors. Historians still argue whether these lavish banquets were genuinely about enjoying food, or if they were more about the social statement of excess. After all, what better way to show your wealth than by feasting on food that only the most elite could afford? But there's a catch. While the guests were dining on all these bizarre delicacies, they were also consuming large amounts of wine, and not just for the flavor. Wine, mixed with water, was essential to Roman dining. Without it, the lavishness of the feast would be incomplete. The more wine, the merrier, right? But the effects weren't always so glamorous. After hours of feasting, many guests were left lethargic, sluggish, and struggling to stay awake. Picture the scene, reclining on plush cushions, digesting all that rich food, while fighting the urge to fall asleep mid-meal. It wasn't uncommon for guests to retreat to a small chamber where they could purge a bit, a technique called vomitorium, though it's more myth than fact in terms of how it was used. Historians have debated whether these feasts were a product of Roman decadence or merely a display of an emerging elite culture. Were they truly about pleasure, or was it all about power dynamics? Either way, Roman feasts remain a bizarre and fascinating chapter of culinary history. But let's ease up a bit, shall we? Imagine how many carbs these Romans were eating: bread, pastries, and a whole lot of garum, that fermented fish sauce. With all those carbs, it's no wonder they needed a nap after lunch. All right, now let's take a deep dive into a particularly unusual part of Roman cuisine. Dormice. Yes, you heard that right. Dormice. These small, furry creatures were a luxury snack for the wealthy Romans, and they were far more popular than you might imagine. Imagine you're at a banquet, and your plate doesn't just feature the usual roast meats and fish. No, you're presented with a dish that contains a few carefully prepared dormice, served either stuffed with a rich mixture of herbs and spices or cooked in honey. If you were a guest at a high-end Roman gathering, you'd be expected to try this tiny, delicate snack. Why dormice, you ask? Well, they were considered a delicacy and were quite the status symbol. Romans didn't just eat dormice. They raised them. There were actually entire farms dedicated to breeding dormice for the dining table. Think of it like a weird version of modern-day farm-to-table dining. These tiny creatures were placed in special cauras where they could sleep during the day and eat nuts or grains to fatten up. In fact, there was a dedicated method for fattening up dormice before consumption, which involved feeding them a very controlled diet to ensure their meat was as plump and tender as possible. Historians still argue whether dormice were really a common meal or simply reserved for the very elite. Some believe they were a rare treat, while others claim that dormice were a staple in the Roman diet, particularly for those who could afford them, regardless of their frequency on the Roman table. They certainly make for an unusual snack by today's standards. It's not exactly the sort of thing you'd find in your local grocery store's deli section, is it? Now, you might be thinking, how on earth did they even prepare such tiny creatures? Well, the Romans were nothing if not inventive. They would often cook the dormice with honey, poppy seeds, and sometimes even stuffed with minced meat and herbs. As bizarre as it sounds, the mix of savory and sweet flavors was exactly the kind of thing Romans loved. Food wasn't just about nourishment. It was about indulging all your senses, and dormice were no exception. In fact, they were sometimes seen as a symbol of wealth and refinement, because only those with enough resources could afford to indulge in such exotic delicacies. So, imagine yourself in a lavish Roman villa. There you are, reclining on your luxurious couch, nibbling on a honey-glazed dormouse, surrounded by the chatter and laughter of your fellow diners. Sure, it's strange, but it's also an essential part of what made Roman feasts so fascinating. Just remember to avoid the snooze button. After all that food, it's hard to nap after eating something so unique. Now that we've indulged in the more bizarre side of Roman dining, let's take a step back and look at the food that actually formed the backbone of the Roman diet: bread, olives, and garum. These three humble staples were present in nearly every meal, and they were the building blocks of the Roman culinary world. Sure, they didn't have the gourmet options we do today, but these items kept the empire running smoothly and kept their bellies full. First, let's start with bread. Bread was so vital to Roman life that it was often referred to as the panis, which just means bread in Latin. Bread was a daily part of life for both the rich and the poor. The types of bread varied depending on your social class. For the average Roman citizen, the bread was coarse and made from wheat, barley, or sometimes even spelt. It wasn't the fluffy white bread you're used to today. In fact, the lower classes often ate a kind of hard, rough bread that they would dunk into wine or water to soften it up. The richer folks, however, had access to more refined loaves, sometimes made with fine flour and even flavored with herbs. Bread was so integral to Roman life that it was a key part of the civitas, the Roman way of life. The state even took responsibility for ensuring that the people had enough bread to eat. There were bakeries in every neighborhood, often run by slaves, and the government would sometimes even provide free bread to those in need. This is where the famous panem et circenses phrase comes from, which translates to bread and circuses. It was the idea that, in order to keep the people content, the government should ensure they had food and entertainment. The Romans knew that a full belly meant happy citizens, at least, for a while. Now, let's talk about olives. Olives were a major part of the Roman diet, but not just as a snack. The Romans were obsessed with olive oil. Olive oil wasn't just used for cooking, it was also used for bathing, anointing the body, and even as a form of medicine. Olives were harvested in vast quantities and turned into oil, which could be found everywhere in Roman society. For the average person, olive oil was often used as a base for cooking, but it was also a way to preserve food. Olives themselves were eaten in various forms, whether pickled, salted, or roasted, but the oil was the real treasure. Historians still argue whether the obsession with olive oil in Roman culture was a symbol of wealth or just a practical necessity. Some suggest that the wealthy used olive oil as a sign of their refined taste, while others believe it was simply a matter of necessity in a world that lacked refrigeration and preservatives. Either way, olive oil was so ubiquitous in Roman kitchens that it became as vital as water for many people. You could say it was the soul of Roman cuisine. Lastly, we have garum, the fermented fish sauce that was both loved and feared. Garum was a condiment made by fermenting fish, usually anchovies, with salt. It was then left to ferment for months until it turned into a pungent, salty liquid that could be added to nearly anything. Romans used garum the way we use ketchup today, drizzled on meats, added to soups, or even sprinkled on vegetables. The sauce had an intense umami flavor that could enhance nearly any dish. Historians still argue whether garum was truly as popular as we think, or whether it was just a culinary quirk of Roman society. Some believe it was an essential part of the Roman diet, while others claim it was more of a niche product for the upper classes. Regardless, garum was a key component of Roman life, and its influence spread throughout the empire. The Roman love for garum even affected trade. There were factories dedicated to producing it, and it was shipped across the Mediterranean, reaching as far as Britain and North Africa. Imagine a Roman soldier stationed in a far-off province, longing for the taste of home, and receiving a shipment of garum as a reminder of Roman civilization. So, as you reflect on these staple foods, bread, olives, and garum, remember that they weren't just meals. They were part of the fabric of Roman life, linking the people of Rome together in a shared culinary experience. And though they might seem simple to us now, these foods were the backbone of the empire, keeping both the rich and the poor nourished throughout the ages. Now that we've covered the basic essentials of Roman life, let's take a step into the grand halls of the elite, where dining wasn't just about filling the stomach. It was an art form. If you were lucky enough to be part of the Roman upper class, your meals would look quite different from the simple bread and beans of the common folk. Picture this: you're reclining on a luxurious couch, your toga draped just so, as a servant places a golden platter of delicacies in front of you. this isn't just a meal, it's a statement. This is the life of an emperor, or at least the life of someone wealthy enough to mimic the emperor's tastes. Roman emperors, senators, and aristocrats had access to the finest foods that the empire could provide. Banquets were held regularly, sometimes lasting for hours, and guests were expected to indulge in multiple courses. The elite didn't just eat to survive. They ate to demonstrate their power, wealth, and sophistication. These feasts often started with simple appetizers like olives, cheeses, and fruits, followed by a procession of extravagant main courses. Think roast wild boar, peacock, and even flamingo, though that one was probably reserved for special occasions. For dessert, there would be honey-soaked pastries, and the final touch, a nice cup of spiced wine to wash it all down. But while the food was lavish, the experience of the banquet was just as important. The wealthy Romans would recline on plush couches, often surrounded by their closest friends, who were probably either high-ranking politicians or fellow members of the elite. Entertainment was a big part of these events. Singers, dancers, musicians, and even philosophers might be invited to entertain the guests. In some cases, guests would engage in philosophical debates or play games, all while eating their way through a seemingly endless number of courses. Historians still argue whether these elaborate banquets were a true reflection of the emperor's power or merely a distraction for the masses. On one hand, these feasts showcased the opulence of Rome's ruling class, reinforcing the idea that they were far removed from the struggles of everyday citizens. On the other hand, some historians argue that these extravagant feasts were a way to keep the elite entertained and distracted from any political unrest or social issues. Bread and circuses, after all. But what about the health consequences of all this indulgence? You might think that eating like an emperor sounds pretty great. Who wouldn't want to gorge on peacock and honey cakes? But in reality, these feasts could take their toll. Romans who dined too much would often experience what we today call food comas. It wasn't unusual for guests to retire to another room where they could purge themselves. Yes, it's true. There was some regurgitation going on to make room for more food. The aim wasn't to feel full, but to indulge to the point of excess. It was all part of the luxury overeat, rest, and then do it all over again. But what's even more fascinating is the role of exotic foods in Roman banquets. Some of the food wasn't even from Rome. The Romans were known for their love of foreign delicacies, which were often seen as a mark of sophistication. This desire for the unusual and the rare led to a booming trade industry, where traders would bring in things like spices from India, rare fruits from Africa, and even odd creatures for consumption. An emperor might eat a rare fruit from the farthest reaches of the empire, just to show that he could. It wasn't enough to have the best food in Rome. You had to have the best food from everywhere else. So, picture this, a banquet that's half spectacle, half indulgence. You're eating food that most people could only dream of, all while lounging in the lap of luxury, surrounded by entertainment and revelry. This is how the Roman elite lived, and it's a far cry from the simple grain-based meals of the plebeians. It's a reminder of how food could transcend the simple need for nourishment and become a symbol of power, wealth, and excess. Now, if we're going to talk about food, we absolutely can't leave out one of the most important aspects of Roman dining, wine. And when I say important, I mean that wine wasn't just a drink for the Romans. It was a culture, an institution, and almost a way of life. The average Roman consumed wine with nearly every meal, and in fact, it was more common to drink diluted wine than plain water. Imagine sipping on wine at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and not just sipping, but almost always mixing it with water. You probably wouldn't want to drink wine straight, Romans considered it barbaric. The wine served at Roman banquets was a far cry from the fine wines we sip today. For one, Roman wine was often much stronger, and very often mixed with various herbs and spices to enhance its flavor. Wine wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about experiencing different flavor and even medical benefits. Romans believed that certain herbs and additives could improve digestion or provide a sense of well-being. You could find everything from sweetened wines to those infused with myrrh, saffron, and even raisins, depending on the region and the social class. Of course, the quality of wine varied if you were wealthy. You had access to more refined wines, but even the average Roman could expect to drink wine regularly. Historians still debate whether the wine consumption in Roman society was more about pleasure or necessity. On the one hand, wine was a central part of daily life for Romans, to the point where it was almost unthinkable to eat a meal without it. On the other hand, there's an argument that the use of wine helped with more practical matters. Wine diluted with water was often seen as safer to drink than the water from public fountains, which could be contaminated. So, it wasn't just about taste. It was a way to ensure people stayed healthy while going about their day. Now, let's talk about symposiums, the Roman version of a drinking party. These gatherings were a chance for intellectuals, politicians, and aristocrats to come together, drink wine, and engage in discussions about philosophy, politics, or just life in general. The focus wasn't necessarily on getting intoxicated, though that certainly happened, but rather on the enjoyment of good conversation and, of course, plenty of wine. At these events, participants would take turns sipping wine, and each person would offer their thoughts on various topics. It was very much a cultural event, and it's often thought of as the precursor to the modern-day cocktail party or wine tasting. But it wasn't all high-minded discussions and refined sips. Some of the more raucous drinking parties were held by the wealthiest Romans, who would often indulge in excessive drinking games and competitions. One of the most famous of these was the symposium. where guests would drink from a single large bowl, and the winner would be the last person still sober enough to drink. These parties were not for the faint of heart, and they could easily spiral into drunken revelry and sometimes debauchery. Of course, Roman soldiers and the lower classes didn't quite partake in such lavish drinking games, but wine was still a staple of their daily diet. For soldiers, wine was often mixed with water to create a pasca, a kind of diluted, sour wine that was both refreshing and nutritious for those on the move. It may not have been the most delicious drink, but it was a practical one, and it helped sustain Roman legions through long campaigns. When you think about it, wine in Roman society was more than just a beverage. It was an essential element of both social and practical life. It tied together the bonds of friendships and power, kept people hydrated, and kept people talking. In a sense, Roman drinking culture was a kind of glue that held their society together, whether at a lavish banquet or on the dusty roads of empire building. As we think about the Romans and their wine, imagine yourself sitting at a Roman banquet. The room is filled with the sound of cheerful chatter, the clink of bronze cups, and the faint, sweet smell of wine mixing with herbs and spices. As you sip your diluted wine, you're not just drinking, it's a tradition. You're participating in a centuries-old custom that blends socializing, food, and culture all in one glass. In a way, you're living like an emperor. Now that we've explored the luxurious banquets and endless wine of Roman life, let's head into the heart of the city and see how the everyday Roman dined. Picture yourself strolling through the crowded streets of ancient Rome, past the bustling markets and noisy vendors. You've had a long day, and you're feeling hungry, but you don't have the time or the inclination to prepare a full meal. No problem. Just like today, ancient Romans had their own version of fast food. Roman street food was as diverse as it was delicious. In fact, it's likely that the street food culture of ancient Rome was more advanced than you might think. Many of the foods that people grabbed on the go were simple but flavorful, designed to be eaten quickly and easily while on the move. Let's start with the most famous Roman street food, panis. Bread. But this wasn't your average loaf. Roman street vendors sold small, flat loaves of bread, often stuffed with a variety of fillings, whether it was a meat filling, cheese, or vegetables. These little bread pockets were perfect for a quick lunch or a satisfying snack. Historians still debate whether street food was only for the lower classes or whether it reached all levels of Roman society. Some suggest that the poorer citizens of Rome were more likely to grab a quick meal from a street vendor, but there's evidence to suggest that even wealthier Romans enjoyed the convenience and variety that street food offered. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for the elite to dine at popinae, which were Roman taverns or snack bars. These were the places where quick meals were served to anyone in need of sustenance. They weren't fancy, but they were efficient. Imagine walking into a popina and ordering a quick bite. Maybe a hearty meat stew or a flatbread covered in cheese. But it wasn't just bread and meat that Romans grabbed from the street vendors. There were also olivae, or olives, which were often sold as snacks on the go. These were sometimes marinated with spices and herbs, making them the perfect snack to munch on while walking around the city. Other popular street foods included fried fish, cheese-filled pastries, and even mortem, a kind of cheesy herb paste that was spread on bread or crackers. These foods were perfect for someone who needed to get food fast, whether they were a laborer in the fields or a senator rushing between meetings. You might be wondering, what did Romans drink with their street food? While wine was always a go-to, they also enjoyed posca, a drink made from sour wine and water, which was popular among soldiers and workers. It was cheap, refreshing, and packed with electrolytes, making it the perfect drink to pair with a salty snack or a piece of bread. And much like the fast food we're familiar with today, posca was often served in large clay mugs, perfect for sipping while on the go. Street food wasn't just about convenience. It also served as a social experience. The popinae and street vendors were gathering spots where people could chat, exchange news, and take a quick break from their busy lives. These places were often crowded, noisy, and lively, with food and drink flowing freely. You could find a range of people at these spots, from ordinary citizens to wealthy Romans, looking for a quick bite between appointments. It was a great equalizer. Everyone, no matter their social status, could enjoy a meal from a street vendor. It's fascinating to think about how much street food culture influenced Roman society. It wasn't just about food. It was about convenience, socializing, and the way people interacted with one another. In many ways, it was the precursor to our modern-day fast food culture, where we grab a quick meal while on the move, sometimes while talking to friends or strangers. It's a reminder that while the Romans may have had a different way of life, their love for quick, delicious food was something that transcended time. So, as you think about your own busy day, imagine stepping into a Roman street market and grabbing a warm, freshly made flatbread stuffed with savory meat and herbs. The smell of fresh bread fills the air, and the sound of voices and laughter surrounds you. It's a simple moment, but it's a connection to a long history of people eating on the go, fueling their lives just as we do today. Now that we've wandered through the busy Roman streets, nibbled on flatbreads, and sipped on posca, let's turn our attention to one of the most unusual yet beloved ingredients in the Roman diet, garum. If you've been following along, you've probably heard of this pungent, fermented fish sauce, and now it's time to delve into why the Romans loved it so much. Garum, made by fermenting fish with salt and allowing it to sit for months in the sun, was the ultimate Roman condiment, a little salty, a little fishy, and packed with flavor. It sounds like an odd concoction, right? But for Romans, garum wasn't just a passing trend. It was a dietary staple found in kitchens across the empire and consumed with just about every meal. But what was so special about garum? Well, for one, it was everywhere. If you were a Roman citizen, rich or poor, garum was likely a part of your daily life. Whether it was drizzled over meat, mixed into sauces, or added to soups, it was an essential component of Roman cuisine. The reason for garum's widespread popularity was simple: flavor. The Romans loved strong, intense tastes, and garum delivered just that: the salty, umami flavor it imparted could elevate any dish, making even the simplest of meals burst with savory goodness. Imagine dipping your bread in a thick, garum-infused sauce, or sprinkling it over a plate of roasted meats. It would have been a completely transformative experience. Historians still argue whether garum was purely a culinary delight or if it held medicinal benefits as well. Some sources suggest that garum wasn't just a condiment, but also used for its supposed health benefits. The Romans believed that it could help with digestion, ease stomach problems, and even treat wounds. This idea may seem a bit far-fetched to us today, but considering the lack of modern medicine, it's not surprising that the Romans would turn to a fermented food like garum for its healing properties. In fact, there were even specialized versions of garum made with added herbs and spices, intended to be consumed as a kind of medicinal tonic. Now, you might be wondering, how did they make this stuff? Well, making garum was a process. The Romans would take fish, usually small ones like anchovies, and layer them with salt in large vats. They'd leave the mixture to ferment under the sun for weeks, sometimes months, until the fish would break down and turn into a thick, aromatic liquid. The process was messy and smelly, and it's not hard to imagine that the air around a garum factory would have been thick with the scent of fermenting fish. But despite the less than pleasant aroma, garum was a hot commodity. Factories in places like Pompeii and Ostia were dedicated solely to the production of this fermented fish sauce, and it was exported across the Roman Empire, from Britain to North Africa. But garum wasn't just about health and flavor. It was also about status. The quality of garum varied depending on the ingredients used and the method of preparation. The best garum, known as garum sociorum, was made from the finest fish and sold at a premium price. It was reserved for the wealthiest Romans, who would use it to create elaborate sauces and dishes. The lower quality garum, known as alec, was sold at a more affordable price and consumed by the common people. Despite its humble origins, garum became a symbol of Roman culinary culture, uniting people across all social classes. Imagine yourself walking through a Roman market with vendors shouting about their garum offerings. You stop at one stall where the smell of fermented fish wafts through the air, and you buy a small jar of this tangy elixir. You're going to add it to your stew or drizzle it over roasted vegetables, just as the Romans have done for centuries. It's not a delicacy anymore. It's part of everyday life. The garum you hold in your hands is a taste of Roman history, a glimpse into their love for bold flavors and their resourcefulness in turning simple ingredients into something so much more. As we move through the empire, we can't forget about the vast impact that garum had on Roman society. It wasn't just a foodstuff. It was a cultural symbol of the empire's vast trade networks and its obsession with flavor, whether consumed for its taste, its health benefits, or as a symbol of luxury. Garum was a central part of Roman dining, one that continued to influence culinary traditions long after the fall of the empire. Now that we've looked at the staples of the Roman diet and their beloved garum, it's time to explore how the Romans actually cooked their food. While we might think of ancient Rome as a land of grand feasts and intricate banquets, Roman cooking techniques were often simple and practical. But that doesn't mean they didn't have some clever methods up their sleeves. In fact, Roman cooks were quite ingenious in how they prepared their food. They didn't have fancy ovens or modern appliances, but they made do with what they had, and the results were often spectacular. One of the most interesting aspects of Roman cooking was their reliance on portable cooking equipment. The Romans had a variety of cooking tools, but many of them were designed to be easily moved, so they could cook food wherever they needed to. This was particularly important for the Roman military, who had to make meals on the move during long campaigns. The focus of Roman cooking was often on the simplicity of the technique, allowing the natural flavors of the ingredients to shine through. They used basic tools like frying pans, boiling pots, and grills to prepare meals. The Romans were also adept at roasting. If you were to walk through a Roman market, you'd likely see a vendor roasting meat on a spit, turning it slowly over a fire. The slow, steady heat would caramelize the meat's surface, creating a flavorful crust, while keeping the interior juicy and tender. But roasting wasn't limited to meat. Vegetables and fish were also roasted, often with a drizzle of olive oil and a dash of salt. These basic cooking methods were accessible to all Romans, from the elite to the common folk, making cooking a shared experience across social classes. Historians still debate whether Roman cooking was intentionally simple or if they just made the best of what they had. The ancient Romans had an abundance of fresh ingredients, from grains and vegetables to meat and fish, but they lacked some of the advanced cooking methods that we take for granted today. Some scholars argue that Roman cooks relied on time-honored methods because they valued the integrity of the ingredients themselves, while others suggest that Roman cooking was deliberately simple and rustic, with the goal of highlighting the flavors of the natural world, in addition to roasting and boiling. Also, one of the Romans' most important cooking techniques was stewing. Romans loved to make hearty, flavorful stews, often mixing meat, vegetables, legumes, and grains into one pot. These stews were easy to prepare, could be cooked in large quantities and were perfect for feeding a crowd. Stews also allowed for a lot of creativity in terms of flavor combinations. In some cases, they might add a splash of wine or a few spoonfuls of garum to give the dish an extra punch of flavor. The versatility of stews made them a favorite for both everyday meals and banquets. You might also be surprised to learn that Romans were early adopters of preserving food. They didn't have refrigerators, of course, but they used methods like salting, pickling, and drying to keep food fresh for longer. Fish, for example, could be dried and salted, allowing it to be stored and eaten during the off-season. Similarly, fruits and vegetables could be preserved through pickling, ensuring that the Romans had access to fresh-tasting food even during the winter months. These preservation techniques were crucial for maintaining a steady food supply, especially in a vast empire like Rome, where transportation and logistics were key challenges. But perhaps the most sophisticated cooking technique the Romans had at their disposal was the hypocaust system, a type of underfloor heating used in baths, villas, and even some restaurants. The hypocaust worked by circulating hot air under the floors of a room, warming the space and cooking food slowly from below. This system allowed for an even controlled heat, which was perfect for cooking delicate dishes. It was a sign of Roman engineering brilliance, combining their love for comfort and luxury with their practical need to cook. Now, imagine yourself as a Roman cook standing over a fire in a busy kitchen. The scent of roasting meat fills the air, while vegetables bubble away in a pot on the stove. A warm breeze blows through an open window, and the sounds of bustling life outside create a backdrop to the work at hand. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. You're simply preparing a meal, but you're doing so with care, using techniques that have been honed over centuries. It's a blend of simplicity and mastery, with the focus on making the most of what you have. As you dig into your meal, you can appreciate the effort and creativity that went into preparing it. The Romans might not have had modern kitchen gadgets or high-end techniques, but they knew how to cook delicious food with the tools at hand, and for them, that was enough. By now, we've wandered through Roman street food, enjoyed some simple bread and garum, and even sipped wine from a communal cup. But here's the part where the Romans really show their love for the finer things in life: meat. If there's one thing that ancient Romans were known for, it was their obsession with animal protein. They didn't just eat meat occasionally. It was an essential part of their diet, especially for those in the upper classes. If you were living in ancient Rome and you could afford it, you probably weren't going a day without a hearty serving of meat. From roasted boar to game birds, the Romans had a taste for meat that would make a modern carnivore jealous. Let's start with the basics. The most common meats consumed in Roman kitchens were pork, beef, and lamb. Pork was particularly popular because it was relatively easy to raise, and the Romans had mastered many ways to cook it. It was often roasted, grilled, or even boiled in soups. The more lavish banquets would feature whole roasted pigs, stuffed with other meats or herbs, and then served to guests on large platters. These large cuts of meat were the highlight of any feast. The wealthy Romans didn't just enjoy roast pork, they also ate sausages, which they made from a variety of meats, including pork and veal. Historians still debate whether the obsession with meat in Roman society was purely a result of cultural preference, or if it was also a social status symbol. On one hand, meat was a source of high-quality protein, necessary for maintaining the energy levels of Rome's legions and working population. On the other hand, it was expensive and often seen as a luxury. To eat meat regularly was a sign of affluence, so much so that it became a status symbol. The more exotic the meat, the higher your social status. And the Romans didn't just settle for farm animals. They went after the more exotic meats too. Speaking of exotic meats, Romans were particularly fond of hunting wild game, like venison, boar, and even birds of paradise found their way onto the Roman menu. There were even special hunting grounds called venationes, where the Roman elite could engage in hunting for sport. Boar hunting was a particularly popular pastime among Roman men, and it was often seen as a symbol of bravery and masculinity. Imagine yourself a Roman aristocrat setting off with your hunting party into the woods, armed with spears and dogs, in pursuit of a wild boar. Once the boar was caught, it would be roasted and served at the next grand banquet, adding to your reputation as a skilled hunter and a wealthy citizen. But the luxury didn't stop there. The Romans were also known for their extravagant feasts, which could include a variety of wild and domesticated meats. For example, flamingo, ostrich, and peacock were considered delicacies, though only the wealthiest Romans could afford to eat them. One of the most curious delicacies of Roman society was dormice. Yes, those cute little creatures we've already mentioned. They were often fattened up in special garb and served as a snack at banquets. It was an odd yet common practice for the elite, who relished these tiny rodents as a sign of their wealth and refined taste. Who would have thought that a tiny rodent would play such a big role in Roman high society? One of the most fascinating aspects of Roman meat consumption was their love of offal. That's right. Romans didn't just eat the prime cuts of meat. They ate everything. Organs like liver, kidneys, and intestines were seen as delicacies and were prepared in various ways, often boiled, fried, or stuffed. These lesser cuts were common in both elite and everyday Roman cooking. For the poorer classes, offal was a way to stretch the meal further, and for the wealthy, it was a way to display their opulence. There was even a dish called isichia, which was made from finely ground meat and mixed with spices, nuts, and wine, essentially an ancient Roman version of a meatball, but with a much fancier twist. But while meat was a symbol of wealth, it also came with its own challenges. Romans understood that too much of a good thing could be detrimental. There are records from Roman medical texts suggesting that a diet too rich in meat could lead to various health problems, including obesity, gout, and digestive issues. Despite this, Romans kept indulging, perhaps because they felt the benefits of protein outweighed the risks, or maybe because they were just too hooked on meat to care. In the end, the love of meat in ancient Rome was a reflection of the culture itself, extravagant, indulgent, and often willing to push boundaries. Whether it was hunting wild boar in the woods, roasting an entire pig for dinner, or eating dormice at a banquet, the Romans didn't just enjoy food. They celebrated it as a form of status, culture, and even sport. So, picture this. You're reclining at a grand Roman banquet, the air thick with the smells of roasting meats. A whole pig, stuffed and golden brown, is placed before you, and around the table, plates of venison, boar, and exotic birds are passed from hand to hand. This is more than just a meal. It's a demonstration of your power, your wealth, and your place within the Roman elite. It's a feast, and you're at the center of it all, indulging in the ultimate carnivorous delight. As we continue our journey through the labyrinth of Roman food, it's time to take a step back from the lavish banquets and dive into some of the quirks that made Roman dining etiquette truly unique and often downright strange. Dining in ancient Rome wasn't just about eating. It was a performance, an art form, and an exercise in social status, and, like any great performance, it came with its own set of rules and peculiarities that were closely tied to the culture of the time. Let's start with the most famous element of Roman dining, reclining. You see, unlike our modern dining tables, where we sit upright to eat, Romans took their meals lying down. Well, sort of, they would lie on their sides, on plush couches, propped up on one arm, with their feet stretched out behind them. This reclining position was reserved for the elite, who dined in grand banquets, while the lower classes would have sat at smaller tables, often eating while standing or on stools. The reclining posture was considered a symbol of luxury and leisure, and it was even believed to aid digestion. As you lay there, sipping your wine and nibbling on dormice, you weren't just feeding your body, you were displaying your status to all those around you. Historians still argue whether this reclining posture was purely about comfort or if it was intended to display wealth. On one hand, reclining made eating more leisurely, allowing Romans to stretch out and socialize with those around them. On the other hand, it could also have been an ostentatious display, reinforcing the idea that the wealthy had the luxury of reclining while others toiled away. Either way, it was a clear social marker, and those who didn't recline were considered less important. Next up, the conversation. Dining in Rome wasn't just about food. It was an opportunity for intellectual discourse. The Roman elite often used dinner parties as a platform for discussion, debate, and even philosophy. You might be halfway through a platter of roast boar when a philosopher guest starts holding forth on ethics or the state of the empire. These conversations were often lively, and guests were expected to contribute. But here's the thing. Roman dinner parties weren't just about exchanging ideas. Oh no, there was a heavy emphasis on polite manners and knowing when to stop talking. At the higher echelons of Roman society, there were rules of conversation, much like the rules of decorum we follow in modern dinner parties, only more elaborate. You had to know the right things to say, when to be silent, and how to interact with those around you. Interrupting was considered rude, and speaking too loudly was a no-no. Romans placed a huge emphasis on eloquence and social grace, and anyone who lacked those qualities would be ostracized. Even the way you passed the food was regulated. You couldn't just grab a piece of bread or snatch a slice of meat off the platter. No, you had to ask for it politely and make sure that the proper person, usually the host or a servant, served it to you. And God forbid you spilled wine or dropped a morsel of food. These were serious faux pas in Roman society. Eating was as much about maintaining one's social standing as it was about nourishment. Of course, as with any social gathering, there were rules about who sat where. The most important person at the feast was positioned in the most comfortable spot, usually in the center of the dining area. Guests were arranged by social rank, with the highest-ranking individuals reclining closest to the host. Those of lesser importance would be placed further away from the center of the room. If you were the lowest-ranking person at the banquet, you might find yourself perched on the edge of the couch, trying to maintain the appearance of dignity while being ignored by the more important people. It was all about maintaining the proper social hierarchy. And eating was just as much about status as it was about food. There were also some curious practices surrounding the aftermath of Roman meals. After hours of indulging in roast meats, wine, and possibly too much garum, it wasn't unusual for guests to feel quite uncomfortable, especially with the heavy, rich meals the Romans consumed. And while today we might just roll over to the couch and watch TV after a big meal, the Romans had a different approach. The vomitorium, despite what some people think. The vomitorium wasn't a place for purging yourself after a meal, thankfully. It was actually just an architectural term referring to the passageways in theaters that allowed large crowds to exit. However, the idea that Romans would deliberately purge themselves during a banquet to make room for more food has become a common misconception. That said, it is true that some wealthy Romans did indulge in vomiting between courses to continue feasting, though it wasn't as common or as encouraged as some might think. Historians still debate how often Romans really purged during their feasts. Some suggest it was an extreme practice associated only with the very wealthy or decadent, while others believe it was merely a symbolic act in a few isolated cases. Either way, the concept of overindulgence was deeply embedded in Roman dining culture. It wasn't just about eating. It was about eating more, pushing the boundaries of appetite, and showing off that you could handle excess without a second thought. As you imagine yourself at one of these grand Roman feasts, reclining on the couch with your fellow diners, you begin to realize that Roman dining etiquette wasn't just about enjoying a meal. It was about playing a part in a social ritual, about maintaining your position in society, engaging in intellectual banter, and indulging in food as both a necessity and a luxury. Every bite, every sip, and every conversation was steeped in tradition and expectation. Now, let's take a journey to the other side of Roman society, the legions. While the elite dined on roasted meats, exotic dishes, and wine, the Roman soldiers had a very different diet. If you were a soldier in the Roman army, you were likely living in harsh conditions and facing long campaigns in distant provinces. Your meals, while not as extravagant, were critical to your survival. And the Roman military had a very practical approach to food. Roman soldiers were fed a ration system that provided them with the basic nutrients they needed to maintain their energy on long marches or while stationed at a fort. The standard rations for a soldier were simple but hearty. The primary components of their diet were grains, usually wheat or barley. These grains could be boiled into porridge, used to bake flatbread, or even made into a kind of basic cake. Think of it as a soldier's version of camping food, where ease of preparation was just as important as taste. But that doesn't mean they were just eating dry grains all the time. Roman soldiers also received salted meat, which was a crucial source of protein. The meat would be heavily salted or dried to preserve it for long periods of time, ensuring that it didn't spoil before it could be eaten. In addition to meat, soldiers were sometimes given cheese, vegetables, and dried fish, all of which could be stored for long stretches without refrigeration. And while the meals might sound a bit plain, they were actually perfectly suited to the needs of a soldier. The key was that they were easy to prepare and packed with the nutrients needed to fuel long days of marching and fighting. Of course, no Roman soldier would be without their daily dose of wine. But in this case, it was diluted wine, often mixed with water to keep the soldiers hydrated without overloading them with alcohol. This diluted wine, called posca, was a staple for soldiers and lower-class Romans alike. It was inexpensive, easy to transport, and provided some of the vitamins and electrolytes needed to stay hydrated during the grueling work of war and camp life. Historians still debate the nutritional value of the Roman soldier's diet. Some believe that the combination of grains, meat, cheese, and wine was enough to keep soldiers healthy, while others argue that this basic diet led to deficiencies, particularly in vitamins and minerals. The soldiers were known to suffer from ailments such as scurvy due to the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. But the military's focus on practicality likely outweighed concerns about nutrition. The soldiers could always rely on the occasional fresh food supply provided by the local communities they conquered, but it wasn't guaranteed. One of the most interesting parts of the soldiers' diet was their rations system, which was an essential part of the Roman military infrastructure. The Roman army had an incredibly sophisticated system for supplying soldiers with food, often relying on supply chains that spanned the entire empire. Rations were carefully measured and distributed to ensure that soldiers had what they needed, especially during long campaigns. Every soldier had a ration book, which tracked their food supplies and allowed commanders to ensure that no one went hungry on the battlefield. This system of supply and logistics was a key factor in Rome's military success, enabling the army to remain well-fed and strong, even in far-flung territories. Imagine yourself as a Roman soldier on the march, carrying your ration pack filled with simple but filling food. You've got a piece of bread, some salted meat, and a flask of posca. This is your sustenance for the day. You'll be marching for hours, but you know that when you finally stop for the night, you'll be able to prepare a meal, eat, and get the rest you need to continue. The simplicity of the soldier's diet might not seem exciting, but it's effective, and it's a reminder that while the Roman elite feasted on luxury foods, the soldiers were the backbone of the empire, sustaining Rome's power with every step they took across the ancient world. As you close your eyes and imagine the march of the Roman legions, the image of a soldier eating a basics, no-frills meal is a powerful one. There's something grounding about the simplicity of the soldier's diet. No grand feasts, no rich wines, just the bare essentials. But in that simplicity, there's strength. It was food for survival, food for battle, and ultimately, food that helped build an empire. Now that we've seen the food the Romans ate on the battlefield, let's take a step back and think about their overall approach to health and fitness. The Romans were known for their physical strength, especially their soldiers, who had to march long distances, carry heavy gear, and fight in battle. But what did the average Roman eat in order to stay fit? Was their diet as balanced and nutritious as we might hope for an empire that valued military prowess and physical strength? In many ways, the Roman diet was quite practical when it came to physical performance. Soldiers, for example, needed high-energy foods to fuel their long marches and battles. Their diet, which included grains, protein-rich meat, and posca, the diluted wine, provided the carbohydrates, protein, and hydration they needed to stay active. But what about the elite? Did they have any particular dietary habits to keep themselves fit, or were they more concerned with indulgence? Interestingly, there's evidence to suggest that the Roman elite actually took their physical health quite seriously. The wealthy class often had access to better food than the common people, and while they did indulge in lavish feasts, they also had access to more balanced meals. For example, fruits and vegetables, though not as abundant in the diet of the lower classes, were prized by the upper classes. These foods, when eaten in moderation, could provide important vitamins and minerals, promoting a healthier, more balanced diet. Historians still argue whether the Roman elite's concern for health was driven more by personal vanity or by genuine interest in maintaining physical fitness. Some scholars suggest that Romans, especially those involved in public life, were keen on staying fit in order to project an image of vitality and strength. After all, a fit and healthy body was a sign of power and discipline, qualities highly prized in Roman society. Others, however, argue that the elite were more interested in enjoying indulgent meals and entertaining guests, focusing on leisure rather than maintaining any kind of consistent physical regimen in terms of exercise. The Romans were also surprisingly active. The military, of course, had the most rigorous fitness regimen. Roman soldiers trained regularly in marching, running, swimming, and combat exercises. Physical fitness was an essential part of their training, as it directly impacted their ability to perform in battle. Outside of the military, the Roman elite participated in various activities that could be considered forms of exercise, like palestra, wrestling, and other sports, hunting, and even the popular pastime of swimming. The wealthy often had private baths with swimming pools, while public baths were a place for exercise, relaxation, and socializing. But despite all this emphasis on physical health, there were a few dietary missteps along the way. The heavy reliance on garum, fermented fish sauce, and wine in the Roman diet may have had negative consequences for health. Excessive consumption of garum could contribute to high salt intake, and the constant drinking of diluted wine wasn't always the healthiest option. Still, despite these indulgences, the Roman diet was far from the overprocessed, high-fat meals of today. Most food was locally sourced and prepared fresh, with an emphasis on natural, simple ingredients. So, did the Romans have the right balance in their diet and fitness routines? In many ways, they did. Their soldiers had a very practical and energy-dense diet. Their elite were more concerned with maintaining physical appearance and strength than indulgence, at least to some extent. And the social structure of Roman society provided ample opportunity for physical activity, even for those who weren't soldiers. But like any culture, the Romans had their contradictions. Though they prized physical prowess, they also loved their excess and indulgence, especially at those lavish banquets. Imagine yourself as a Roman soldier, or perhaps as a citizen partaking in the busy daily life of Rome. You've just finished a long march or a workout in the palestra, your muscles tired, but your body fueled by a hearty meal of bread, meat, and a glass of posca as you settle down for the evening. You reflect on the food you've consumed that day and the physical strength you've worked hard to maintain. It's a balanced existence, one that celebrates both fitness and food, indulgence and discipline. Even in a world as complex as ancient Rome, the Romans knew that food and fitness went hand in hand. As we start to wrap up our journey through Roman cuisine, it's impossible to ignore the lasting impact that the ancient Romans have had on how we eat today. While many of the foods, customs, and techniques we've discussed might seem long gone, the legacy of Roman dining still echoes through modern kitchens, restaurants, and even our everyday meals, from the simple bread of the plebeians to the luxurious feasts of the emperors, Roman dining has shaped much of what we consider familiar and comforting in our own food culture. Let's start with one of the most obvious influences, the very concept of the banquet. We've already seen how Roman feasts were not just about eating, but about displaying wealth, power, and status. These elaborate banquets, complete with multiple courses and endless wine, set the stage for many of the grand meals we still see today, especially at holiday gatherings, weddings, and other celebrations. While we might not be reclining on couches or eating flamingo tongues, the idea of indulging in a meal that lasts for hours, surrounded by family and friends, can still be traced back to Roman times. Historians still argue about how much influence Roman dining traditions had on later European dining practices, particularly in medieval Europe. Some suggest that Roman banquets, with their complex series of courses and entertainment, laid the groundwork for the lavish feasts of the Middle Ages. Others argue that those customs were more influenced by Greek and Eastern traditions. Regardless of the specifics, the cultural importance of food as a means of socializing and showing wealth is deeply Roman in origin. Another area where the Romans left a lasting mark is in the ingredients we eat today. Roman cuisine was built on a foundation of simple, hearty foods like bread, cheese, olive oil, and wine, all staples in modern diets, particularly in Mediterranean regions. The Mediterranean diet, famous for its health benefits, is largely based on the same principles the Romans lived by. Olives and olive oil were central to Roman life, as they are in modern Mediterranean cooking. Bread, although it's evolved over centuries, remains a global staple. And the way we prepare it, baking, using flour and grains, still follows the Roman example. Garum, while it may seem like an ancient oddity, has had its own influence. The concept of fermented fish sauces has made a return in many parts of the world. In Southeast Asia, for instance, fish sauces like nuoc mam in Vietnam or nam play in Thailand play a central role in cooking, just as garum did for the Romans. While these modern sauces may differ in flavor and preparation, they share a common history rooted in the Roman fondness for fermented fish and strong, salty flavors. And let's not forget wine. While we might not drink it the same way the Romans did, mixed with water and consumed throughout the day, Roman love for wine has certainly carried on through the centuries. Today, wine is enjoyed in nearly every corner of the world, and many of the best-known wine-producing regions, from France to Italy, trace their origins back to ancient Roman viticulture. Romans were pioneers in developing various winemaking techniques, such as aging wine in wooden barrels and refining the process of fermentation, which has had a profound influence on the modern wine industry. Then there's pizza. And while it may not be entirely accurate to say the Romans invented pizza, they certainly laid the groundwork for it. Roman flatbreads, topped with olive oil, herbs, and sometimes cheese, can be seen as distant cousins of the modern pizza. The word pizza itself might not have been used, but the concept of a bread base topped with various ingredients can trace its roots back to Roman culinary practices. Even our modern concept of fast food finds its origins in the Roman accompaniment. These were the Roman equivalent of taverns or street food vendors, where you could grab a quick meal, much like our modern food trucks or street vendors. The accompaniment served inexpensive and easily accessible meals to the public. The similarity between Roman street food culture and today's bustling food scene in cities around the world is remarkable. Grab-and-go meals are as Roman as they come, but perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of Roman dining is the idea of the meal as a social event. In Rome, food wasn't just about sustenance. It was a chance to engage in conversation, show off your wealth, and build social relationships. This is something we still see today in our culture of dining out, whether it's a casual meal with friends or a celebratory dinner at a fancy restaurant. The importance of food as a communal experience, a shared pleasure, is a deeply Roman tradition that has lasted for centuries. So, as you sit down to your next meal, whether it's a simple sandwich or an elaborate dinner, take a moment to reflect on the long history that's brought us to this point. Every bite is connected to a rich cultural history, one that stretches all the way back to ancient Rome. Whether it's the bread you're eating, the olive oil you're drizzling on your salad, or the wine you're sipping, you're tasting a bit of Roman history with every dish. As we slow down and begin to wrap up our journey through the lavish, quirky, and sometimes downright strange world of Roman dining, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've learned. The Roman Empire, with its vast reach and complex society, shaped much of the way we eat and think about food today. From the simple meals of the soldiers to the grand feasts of emperors, food was central to Roman life. Whether it was a means of survival, an indulgence in luxury, or a way to reinforce social status. As we ease into this final part of our exploration, let's remember that Roman dining wasn't just about eating. It was about culture, socialization, and, perhaps most importantly, the shared experience of sitting down together to enjoy a meal. Whether it was sharing a loaf of bread with friends in the marketplace, or reclining at an opulent banquet with philosophers and politicians, the meal was a time to connect, to discuss, and to indulge in the pleasures of life. Now, picture yourself once again at a Roman feast, reclining on a plush couch, a plate of roasted meats before you, and a glass of wine in hand. The chatter of your fellow diners fills the air, the sound of laughter and intellectual debate merging with the clink of cups and the aroma of freshly prepared food. As you relax into the moment, there's a sense of timelessness, a feeling that, for a brief moment, you are part of something far bigger than just your own dinner. The meal is more than nourishment. It's an experience, an indulgence, and a reflection of an empire's values. all served on a golden platter. But as we let the images of Roman feasts fade, and let the quiet of the night settle in, we also realize how much of Roman dining still echoes through our lives today. The meals may have changed, but the joy of sharing food, the rituals surrounding it, and the bond it creates between people are timeless. The Romans taught us that food is more than just sustenance. It's a way to connect, to show care, and to celebrate the moments we share. Now, let's start to wind down. Close your eyes and imagine the distant echoes of Roman banquets, the laughter fading into the background, the flicker of candlelight slowly dimming. You're no longer at the feast, but the warmth of it lingers soft, comforting, like the gentle embrace of a good meal shared among friends. Take a deep breath, let go of the stories, and allow yourself to drift into peaceful sleep, knowing that for a moment you've shared in the ancient history of a civilization that loved food just as much as we do today. With that, the echoes of Roman dinners fade away, and you're left in the quiet of the night, wrapped in the warmth of history and the comfort of the present. Sweet dreams.